Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I'm your host, author Matthew Hines. Today we have such an amazing show. You're really going to love it. We have award-winning journalist Troy Anderson. He is the author of Trumpocalypse as well as The Babylon Code. It's really going to be a great show. So before we get started, I want to send a shout out to some of our new subscribers. We're getting so many of them, but I want to say hello to Rayonda Ryan. I want to say hello to Diana Martinez. I want to say hello and welcome to Elwin, Anthony John, and of course we can't forget White Lotus. Welcome, everybody, to the Books in Hindsight family, and for you dozens and dozens of other subscribers, welcome as well. I also want to say hello to Robin at the Mirage Hair Salon in Redmond, Washington. Robin is a great hairstylist. She did this to my hair, so just think what she can do to yours. And now that brings up another good point. That is, nobody pays me anything to do this podcast or to say anything about them on Books in Hindsight. How we make our money is through affiliate links to books by our great authors. So if you want to purchase one of our guests' great books, please do so from the affiliate links at Books in Hindsight or hindsight.com, where you can purchase my great books as well. All right, last thing, please consider a sponsorship on Patreon to ensure Books in Hindsight continues throughout the years. Now that that's all out of the way, let's bring out Troy Anderson. Let's go to the phone.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Hines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Books in Hindsight. As I promised you, I have the most amazing author and journalist. I have Troy Anderson. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of background on Troy, and then I'll let you, I'll let him explain a little bit more to you about his background, his philosophy, and his motivation for writing Trumpocalypse and his other book, The Babylon Code. So first thing, Troy was a reporter and also editor and bureau chief at the Los Angeles Daily News, and we certainly want to talk to him about that. So just with that background, and to let you know that if you want to follow along with the podcast, go to troyanderson.us, and you can see his books there, and you can see descriptions, and you can also see information on his co-author, Paul McGuire. And with that, let's bring him out. Troy Anderson, welcome to Books in Hindsight.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's great to be on your show.
Well, it's certainly great for us, Troy. You are a great journalist. I didn't mention yet that you were nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and we are going to talk today about your journalistic experience and how that led you to write the book Trumpocalypse. But before we do any of that, Troy, could you just talk to us a little bit about your background? I probably left something out because it's so extensive. Could you tell us a little bit about your journalistic background as well as your, I guess, philosophical background?
Oh, okay. Well, I grew up in a small town in Oregon. I attended the University of Oregon Journalism School and spent 2 decades working at different newspapers, starting out the Nevada Appeal in Carson City and ultimately the Los Angeles Daily News and the Press Enterprise. And a few years ago, I was executive editor of Charisma magazine, and I've co-written 2 best-selling books, The Babylon Code and Trumpocalypse. That's sort of the background in a nutshell. In terms of my philosophy, I'm probably, sort of center-right conservative.
Okay, so that can be our first avenue into this discussion. Okay, so you are a center-right journalist. What are you doing in journalism? Isn't journalism just for the left these days?
Well, back, when I first started out, there was still sort of a semblance of objectivity in journalism. And so, conservatives were welcome in newsrooms around the country. And, but things have changed the last 10 years, as we've seen with much of the mainstream media, unfortunately. And there's this extreme partisanship that's emerged. So there's, today I write for Newsmax and Town Hall and different, sort of conservative publications. So there's sort of this whole universe of Christian and conservative media outlets now, and you have sort of mainstream media. So in some ways, it's sort of like it was back in the early 1900s with the muckraking journalism. You have very partisan newspapers, and it wasn't until the 30s and 40s and 50s that sort of objective journalism entered the scene. But now we're back to this very partisan kind of media atmosphere.
Right. And so, yeah, it's because you're talking about muckraking journalism and then post-war journalism. I guess it was probably more just because there were a limited number of media outlets competing for readers. And if you had fake media, then people were probably going to switch to a different avenue of information. So you got into the journalism business about what, can we ask what year?
Yeah, so my first newspaper was, actually I started freelancing for the Oregon Daily Emerald at the University of Oregon back in 1990, I think it was. And actually, this is an interesting story. I'm a descendant of Friedrich von Schiller. He's the German poet and playwright, wrote Ode to Joy and some plays like Don Carlos and William Tell and Marie Stuart. And my grandmother, when I was a kid, she would always talk about Schiller. She just absolutely loved Schiller and encouraged me to become a writer. So I started writing poems and short stories and songs a lot when I was a kid. And then at some point, I was going to college. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. My dad says, "Why don't you take journalism? You'll be good at that." And so, he sort of encouraged me in that way. And so I, became a reporter. And just really loved it, especially investigative reporting. I did a couple, sort of investigative pieces at the University of Oregon, and I just really loved it. And so over the decades, I've done a whole bunch of, investigative series, and these 2 books are both investigative books in nature.
Okay, well then we might as well just ask this question now, because as we see in the media, we see that it's more about reporting off social media posts, and people are not actually out digging up stories anymore. What's the reasoning for that?
Yeah, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of the great investigative, journalism that we've seen in the past. And there's still quite a bit going on, but you're right. It's all very superficial and social media driven now. And so, and because, we only have one newspaper and they're not as widely read as they used to be in cities across America, the government's less accountable. And our founding fathers understood that freedom of the press was extremely important in order to maintain a democracy. And so we're sort of seeing the consequences of this as we've lost, investigative journalism, because it's expensive for newspapers and media outlets to, dedicate, a reporter to spend a bunch of time on a project. You got to really, dig into it, research. And, it's just easier and cheaper to, just to have people, aggregating news and doing that kind of thing. But, we've lost one of our pillars of democracy, which is, the media is supposed to hold the powerful accountable and expose what's really going on, tell people the truth. And so we're in this media atmosphere where, the large media companies are controlled by a handful of, super wealthy globalists, essentially, and who largely dictate sort of the media philosophy and direction today.
Okay, and I just want to jump in and say that Troy and Paul McGuire also have another book. It's called The Babylon Code, and we're going to ask Troy to come back at a later date to talk about that. But when he talks about this establishment elite that basically controls the media. That's the topic of that. But in Trumpocalypse, and I want to say that so people understand it is Trumpocalypse. It's a different bent because we're really talking about the reaction to Donald Trump, and I assume a lot of that is, of course, the media. But I have a couple of things that I want to hit on when we're talking about why the media doesn't do its job. The first one is, and you touched on it, it's a corporation, right? So how much of do our investigations quashed because either of legal fears, like remember that movie about the tobacco thing, and CBS or 60 Minutes didn't want to run it because they didn't want to get sued. How much of that is actually dictates the news that we see today?
Yeah, I mean, there's still quite a bit of investigative journalism going on, but there's sort of like certain taboo topics that you're not allowed to investigate in the mainstream media. For instance, here's an interesting story. I interviewed Jim Marrs, who's a New York Times bestselling author, wrote Rule by Secrecy and a whole bunch of books that sort of expose what we're talking about here, sort of the globalist elite and these secret societies and the real power structure of the world. And he used to be an investigative reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So we were doing an interview, we're sort of swapping stories, and he told me that when he was working there, he discovered that the CIA had an ownership in the newspaper. And then he found out that most of the mainstream media companies around the country all had sort of this partial CIA ownership. And he was shocked, And I remember, I went to one of my editors at the LA Daily News back in, it was like 2000 or something like that. And I'd read Rule by Secrecy. I was just blown away by this book. I was like, wow, there's all this evidence of what, sort of how the world really works. And I sort of told her a little bit about it. And she goes, shh, we don't talk about that kind of stuff here. So there's, sort of this unspoken rule, in the mainstream media that there's certain topics you just don't touch, and it's sort of the causes of the globalist elite, these mega corporations and there's tons of money, tons of power, tons of influence. There's just certain things that you're pretty much not allowed to dig into.
Okay, so Troy, what are you allowed to dig into then? I mean, it sounds pretty limited.
Well, I mean, today I have, pretty much, widespread freedom because I'm an independent journalist. I write for different media outlets and mostly conservative ones, and so there's really no restrictions on me now. That's why we were able to write the Babylon Code, which is an expose of globalism, and combined with exploration of mystery Babylon in the Book of Revelation. And then President Trump ran a campaign of Americanism, not globalism, would be our credo. And he was the first president to sort of challenge the globalists. And so our second book is the second book in the series and explores the prophetic significance of his presidency and how it fits into unfolding end-time events. And then also a further expose of the globalist elite and what their ultimate plan is.
Okay. So, yeah, let's I wanted to just talk a little bit more about your journalistic background. So you write for also like Reuters. You're a mainstream writer, you're a mainstream journalist. So what do you think the effect is of basically, because you're talking about you have your left-wing news, your right-wing news, and Ronald Reagan, I think, said it that, well, we just have different versions of history. So what's the danger in this?
Well, yeah. So it's essentially you have sort of half the country reading these conservative, media outlets. And so they're getting, sort of that skewed kind of version of reality. And then you have roughly half the country reading these, sort of liberal, progressive kind of media outlets. And so they're getting that version. And so there's sort of equal indoctrination going on both sides. And, it's not really good because, people aren't getting the full spectrum of information. I believe that most of these conservative outlets and Christian outlets are giving us, pretty much what is close to the truth. And so I prefer to write for these and to read these. But, we have a very large segment of the population that probably doesn't, read this kind of information or see it on TV or hear, broadcasts and that kind of thing. And so they get a very skewed version. And there's literally, billions of dollars being spent by, advertising companies and public relations and think tanks and foundations and government agencies and intelligence agencies to, control what we think about, how we think, sort of this scientific mind control. involves social media and all different types of things, Hollywood, and to control how we think. And we're sort of living in this Orwellian Big Brother world that George Orwell warned us of in 1984.
Right, and it is very scary. And so you talk a little bit about I think it is Trumpocalypse. And when you start talking about Orwellian code and Trumpocalypse, you make a reference to the use of the term deplorables. And we've never seen anything like this in American history, but we saw it in Nazi Germany, right? Where the Jews and other people were considered like subhuman. And suddenly we have a political party basically calling a very large portion of the United States subhuman. And so where does all that come from? And how did Donald Trump spark that?
Yeah, so over the last several decades, we've seen sort of these memes enter public consciousness. Like in Trumpocalypse, we point out that the term conspiracy theory was actually invented by the CIA to discourage journalists from investigating, certain kind of corruption scandals involving, very powerful, wealthy individuals. And deplorables is another kind of a term that was most likely developed by some think tank. And, Hillary Clinton, of course, used that term in her speech and became famous. And now, many people sort of, sarcastically refer to themselves as deplorables. But the danger in these kind of terms and this, these memes and way we become to view ourselves is that, in a way it dehumanizes people, and it sets us, essentially, what the elite are doing here is they're setting up conservatives and Christians as, by demonizing them constantly and using terms like deplorables that, you can sort of, take the moral high ground and say that we're better than these people and therefore we can discriminate against them. Ultimately, the Bible warns that this will result in persecution and widespread death of Christians. And so, we're on this downward spiral towards, I believe, what, the Bible predicts will happen. And this is part of what we're seeing, how this is unfolding.
Yeah, and it also, listening to you talk, Troy, and I'm taken back to World War I and the racist of the depiction of the German as the Hun and this evil blood dripping skull coming after you, and then depicting the Japanese as subhuman. And I don't know how much it went on in Korea, but it seems like this is something the government is used to. It seems like a common tactic when they want to get people motivated. So that really scared me, that in the United States, where we all get along and we used to joke around and politics was funny and it was fun, but now it's just it's an excuse for hatred or whatever. But okay, so let's get into Trumpocalypse. I have to ask you, because the predecessor to Trumpocalypse, would you just give us a little background on the Babylon Code?
Oh, okay. So, yeah. So, the Babylon Code is the first book by Paul McGuire and I, my co-author, Paul McGuire. He's an internationally recognized prophecy expert, Fox News, History Channel commentator. He used to have a nationally syndicated radio show called The Paul McGuire Show. It's heard all over the country. And so several years ago, I got into a prophecy conference where I was a reporter at the LA Daily News. I've always been interested in prophecy. A minister who led me to the Lord when I was 11, he gave me a copy of Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, and it was the best-selling book of the 1970s. And so I just became very fascinated with Bible prophecy. So I went to this conference, and I think Tim LaHaye was there, and David Hawking and Paul McGuire speaking. With like several thousand people there. And I heard him say, the world is undergoing the greatest transformation since the Tower of Babel, a coming global government, cashless society, and universal religion. And when I heard that, it just struck me that, my God, if this is true, this is a gigantic story. So I introduced myself to him. We became friends, and it began this decade-long sort of journey of reading hundreds of books, doing hundreds of interviews, reviewing thousands of pages of, government documents and, all kinds of different reports and news stories. And so we sort of put this all together, all the evidence, the best evidence that we could find to dig into this question: are the global elite Are they involved in some kind of plan to, create some kind of globalist society, some form of global government? And how does this fit into Bible prophecy? And is it predicted in the Bible? And so, we interviewed everybody from Billy Graham and Tim LaHaye, Hal Lindsey, Joel Rosenberg, Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, Pastor Greg Laurie, all kinds of faith leaders and prophecy experts. And the overwhelming consensus is that, yes, we're in the run-up to these end-time events predicted in the Bible. But then even more surprising is we interviewed secular experts like Noam Chomsky and professors at Princeton and Yale and Oxford. They have these existential risk institutes, Future of Humanity at Oxford, and they believe that we're approaching the end of human civilization. They're concerned about nuclear war and extreme climate change and artificial intelligence run amok, or we could get hit by an asteroid, things that are extreme pandemic that could go worldwide. And so there's this consensus among both essentially sides that, we're in great danger, and this is a real threat to humanity.
Okay, and so basically the consensus is the clock is ticking. Now, you keep referring back to this biblical code, which is really what I like to do is bring Troy back and talk about the Babylon Code. But how does this code apply to President Trump?
Yeah, so the Babylon Code is an expose of globalism and delves into the things I just talked about, but it also explores what's considered one of the Bible's greatest mysteries. It is called Mystery Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18, and Bible scholars have puzzled over this for centuries as to what Mystery Babylon is. And so we first read about Babylon in Genesis 11, where it talks about the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, this dictator, this tyrant, creating this great tower. And so there's been all kinds of questions about what was the purpose of this tower? Was it some kind of occult or astrological tower? Was he trying to contact demonic entities? Was it some kind of portal? And so, God sees that, humanity is not obeying his commands to, spread throughout the world. And so he intervenes essentially what is the first attempt at a globalist society, a sort of a world government of its time, an economic system, a cult-based religious system. And many people believe that ancient Babylon is the origin of the secret societies. And so for thousands of years after Babylon, these secret societies, all kinds of different names over a great period of time, passed down all these secret knowledge that these secret societies today maintain. And so then we see Babylon reemerge in the books of the prophets, and it's often used as an instrument of God's judgment, and sometimes it's judged involving the Jewish people. And then Babylon reemerges in Revelation as this great mystery. Is it some kind of worldwide system that emerges in the end times? Is it, there's been speculation, could it be the Catholic Church? Could it be European Union? Could it be America? Could it be Islam? Or is it a global system? And we argue that it's an emerging global occult kind of system that we see emerging now that involves very powerful globalist kind of individuals and an amalgamation of, think tanks and corporations and different kind of secret societies and quasi groups. You hear about the Bilderberg Group, and this is sort of this all these globalists, sort of coming together to, they believe that, that they want to create a utopia on Earth. And because of their great concerns that we could, destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons or climate change could, cause potential extinction on the Earth or something like that. So they had all these concerns, and so they think the solution is that we create some kind of globalist society so we can address poverty, get rid of nuclear weapons, and address climate change, and then everything will be fine. But the Bible warns that this is this will be taken advantage of at some point by the figure known as the Antichrist, who will essentially establish a global totalitarian government, exploiting these naive hopes.
Okay, and I would just have to throw in here, because I've been seeing this most of my life as well. I grew up in the LDS church, so we're also very aware of the book of Revelation and Babylon. And as a person who studies history, I would say that, there's been so many times in history where you look at Revelation and then you say, oh, well, this could be like the fall of Constantinople. This could be a different time. So what makes now so different from all these other times? And I think that people said Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist because he had there were 6 letters in Ronald Wilson Reagan. So why now? Why Trump?
Speaking of Ronald Reagan, I did an interview with Jerry Jenkins, who co-authored the Left Behind series with Tim LaHaye, and he said that the most popular letters they get, still get tons of mail and have got tons of mail for a couple of decades now, is about half the mail they get is people saying that the current president is the Antichrist. And so this is a speculation that's gone on for literally centuries. You can go back and see all kinds of different leaders over the centuries. Everybody thought that was this person was the Antichrist. But what is different today is that one of the major super signs of Bible prophecy is the rebirth of Israel in 1948. And there's many prophecy experts that believe that the generation that saw that happen would see the fulfillment of these prophecies. And so that's one of the major things that leads prophecy scholars to believe that we're living in this time. The other thing that's very interesting is that for the first time in history, we have the technologies to actually create some kind of global economic system where we're seeing the rollout of these microchip implants at different companies around the world. And there's a move towards a cashless society. And this is the first time in history where we actually have the technology to create some kind of global economic system. And we have this massive surveillance state. All our cameras, our cell phones, even our TVs and other electronic appliances, they can literally turn on these things and record us in our homes. We're almost like living in the Truman Show now, where you've got the NSA and all kinds of intelligence agencies just literally, gathering just gigantic gigabytes of information about the, everything we're doing, worldwide. And so we have this Orwellian surveillance society for the first time in history. So, we're actually at the point in time where the technologies allow for some kind of, global system. And we have, for decades now, the globalists are trying to move us into this globalist system. And this is really the first time in history that's actually really possible, with all the different, international laws and treaties and the United Nations and similar bodies, the, World Bank and IMF and all these things. We have these international organizations that could potentially, be used to, facilitate this kind of thing. And the Bible says this will ultimately happen. So we're sort of seeing it all unfolding now for the first time. There's many other different signs. There's speculation that we've seen an increase in, gigantic natural disasters over the last, 5-6 decades. And, Jesus warned about things like that. But I think the technologies and the push for globalism and the rebirth of Israel are some of the key things the Bible talks about that, indicate we're living in this time.
Okay, so let's, I want to ask you about the structure of Trumpocalypse. Who contributed? Am I seeing some Jim Marrs in here? Am I seeing some Pat Robertson in here? Am I seeing some Billy Graham in this book?
Yeah, I did 50 different interviews for Trumpocalypse. And, of course, what I would do is I sort of laid out the structure of the book, and then I would send a chapter synopsis to my co-author, Paul. And I'd say, send me some material on, talking about this kind of stuff. And then I'd sort of merge these interviews, the research that I'm doing with his writing, we sort of merge it together. And we've done this on 2 books now. And, it just works out very well because we think very similar. And so, I did an interview with Billy Graham a few years ago before he passed away. And he said that signs of the end of the age are converging for the first time since Jesus made those predictions. And so I, include his interview in this book. I interviewed Jim Marrs a couple of years ago before he passed away. And so I include some of his stuff and some of the key research that he did in different books. I just, became very interested in his books over the years. I didn't interview Pat Robertson, but we did interview people like Noam Chomsky, Pastor Greg Laurie, a couple of generals, former CIA guys. There's several professors at, I think, at Princeton and different places, and other Bible prophecy experts. So we sort of put it together to add credibility to the book. So it's not just Paul and I writing stuff and citing research, but it's also I try to find the most highly credible people I can to to interview and see what they think about all this, and then put it all together. So the books really lay out the evidence in a credible fashion. That's part of our idea.
Okay, and if you're just tuning in or you don't know, you forgot what we're talking about, we are talking to Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist Troy Anderson, and we're talking about his book, Trumpocalypse, and it is a collection of basically interviews, essays, questions that he asked to people about our times. And did you ask them necessarily about President Trump?
Well, yeah. So the book, also explores the rise of the Trump presidency. Like, as I mentioned, he campaigned against globalism, and he said Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo. And then, and then everybody was stunned. Worldwide when he became president, and how could this happen? Franklin Graham, I think, came out the day after Trump had won, and said the media didn't understand the God factor in all this. So there's been many faith leaders who've said that they believe that God may have intervened in some kind of fashion to help President Trump become elected. In fact, the Bible says that God deposes kings and he raises up others. So in that sense, pretty much any leader that's ever lived, in some fashion had God's, I guess, sort of stamp of approval in some way, either for good or bad. So it's not necessarily that, God raised up President Trump for, a totally good purpose. There could be, multiple dimensions to his presidency and why he's our president at this time. As I understand the Bible, so our book explores, that element and the role he's playing, and in fact, we essentially make the argument that, he's standing, he's like the one thing standing between us and the globalists and their new world order that they like to unleash on the planet. And right now, he's, thanks to sort of his warrior spirit and his masterful, the way he handles the media and Twitter and negotiations, and his skills over a lifetime as a businessman. So even though we're seeing all this negative stuff about him, and of course he lived the life of sort of a playboy billionaire, and perhaps he became a believer here recently. But we make the argument that he has sort of the skill set we need at this time in history to sort of hold back these essentially forces of darkness that are trying to, we argue, move us into this global system.
Yeah, but Troy, how much of it's books like your Trumpocalypse, it's books like your Babylon Code, it's people like you, Jim Mars, even I even wrote a book about this kind of stuff, but how much is the public just becoming educated about it, and that's what got Trump or President Trump elected? Because people know the jig is up. People have figured out the game, and it's everywhere.
Yeah, there's been this sort of global raising of consciousness in the last decade or so. For a long time, people were sort of had sort of vague notions about some of these kind of things, but weren't really sure about it. And we're sort of afraid to talk about it because if you brought this kind of stuff up, you'd be sort of ostracized. It might affect you economically. You might lose friends. They might think you're sort of crazy, that kind of thing. But so polls a few years ago show like maybe 20-30% of people thought that there are sort of, powerful behind the scenes forces that are, largely manipulating our political systems and governments. But, after the term the deep state came out, the poll, I think I cite in Trumpocalypse, that 75% of the public believes that deep state exists and that they and the globalist elite largely control the political system. In fact, I interviewed a professor at Princeton who studied this, and when he went into the study, he thought that he'd find that the elite has quite a bit of influence over our political system, but not as much as we might think. And what he found is that regular everyday people have almost no impact on our political system, and the elite have almost total control, through campaign contributions and lobbyists and PR firms and the whole gamut. And so we now live in this sort of this oligarchical kind of society where, big money largely controls everything, big corporations and all the associated, think tanks and foundations and the media, to sort of a certain extent, which is largely controlled by these corporations and very wealthy individuals. And so we're living in this society now where, like you said, people are, quite a bit aware of what's happening now. And so there's resistance to it. We saw it with Brexit in Europe. We saw it with the election of Donald Trump. And in sort of these populist kind of movements that are breaking out around the world now. So we're, it's an open question as to what's going to happen here. But we encourage people to be brave, to be courageous, and to stand up for our liberty and our freedom. We're I believe we're in great danger, and it's incumbent upon us to just like our forefathers did, the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II. We have a long history of people, standing up and being brave and risking their lives for freedom and liberty. America's not perfect and has, committed all kinds of terrible things over the centuries, but, it's sort of the best thing we got. We still got, literally polls show hundreds of millions of people would like to move to America. And so, it's important for us to be brave and to stand up at this time.
Yeah, and you'd be proud of me, Troy, because I risked my life. I ran as a Republican for the Senate in Washington State.
Oh, they're right.
Yeah. So because I'm just like that. I'm a veteran, and I really couldn't stand what was going on. But let's try to be as objective as possible when we're talking about your book. So let's talk about. You talked about people not wanting to get involved because of financial concerns. Can you explain a little bit about what financial concerns we should have and what you uncovered in your book?
So what I was referring to there is, if you talk about this kind of stuff, it could affect, your employment. It's, one of your bosses, doesn't like this kind of thing. But that's a thing for a journalist to consider. God is taking care of me is what I believe. That's what I was referring to there.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of going back to Pat Robertson's book, which I read. I think I was in the 10th grade, and The New World Order. And he just talked about how newspapers, people who rely on banks for things like payroll, are not going to say or do things because once you cut off their source of funding, they're no longer viable as a business. And how much of that is a threat to what people say and how they conduct business?
Yeah. I would say that is a threat, and that's one of the great dangers. If we move into this cashless society, this would give the elite, control over our money or our finances. And so, like we're seeing happen in China now, they're rolling out this social credit score, and the idea is essentially if you sort of go along with the communist state, then you get a high score, and so you can travel, you can buy good, nice homes, you can get a nice job, and you sort of have freedom in society and you get all the benefits. But if you have a low score, then you're sort of discriminated against, and you may have trouble finding employment, getting a driver's license. That they're still developing it, but the concern is this kind of thing can be rolled out worldwide, and it's very dangerous. I mean, this is completely Orwellian, and so that's one of the things that could be part of this system where they use that along with the cashless society to sort of control dissent and clamp down on people objecting to what's happening.
Yeah, and I saw a thing on, they did a documentary on Google and how Google has almost adopted these same policies. And you've probably seen it because you do a lot of investigative reporting, but there was a Canadian that he went against something and they completely cut him off. So once you're de-Googleized, you're completely out of business. No YouTube videos, no Gmail, no nothing. And all your information is just gone. So, and there's nobody to check that. So did you uncover, did you cover this in Trumpocalypse?
Yeah, I haven't heard about the de-Googleization. deal. But yeah, we're hearing more and more about all this censorship going on. They deplatformed Alex Jones, and there's I'm hearing from many friends and people, especially people in sort of the Bible prophecy community, that have ministries and write articles about this kind of stuff. That their Facebook posts and their Twitter posts and similar kind of social medias, the views and such, YouTube is down quite a bit. So there seems to be sort of widespread censorship going on of certain kind of conservative kind of views. And so, yeah, it's a widespread phenomenon now, it seems.
Trey, do you find yourself censored?
Not so much. I think generally, my social media is about the same as it's always been. I still get, thousands of, views and hundreds of likes and that kind of thing. So I don't, maybe I'm under the radar or something.
Yeah. Well, don't monetize your videos. That's my trick. So here's what I have to ask you. Now, we've talked about how, we talked about Googleization and there just doesn't seem to be an upcry where if this stuff would have happened in the 70s, could you imagine? Remember when they had those Hal Lindsey videos about the end of the world, and remember the Omen and all those? Could you imagine what would have happened if the things that they're doing today had happened back then? Did you uncover this in Trumpocalypse or the Babylon Code about what was the conditioning process that brought us to basically a population of people that just take everything for granted and they just don't ask questions?
Yeah, this is an interesting phenomenon. So when I became a believer back in 1979, everybody was talking about the second coming and, Hal Lindsey's book and, the Omen, and like you said, and those are real popular topic back then. And churches would often talk about Bible prophecy. You could go to like a camp or something and hear, preachers talking about this subject. But today there's almost like this, even though we're watching all this stuff actually happening now there's like this silence, especially in the church. There's a small percentage of churches that today they'll talk about this and are brave enough to talk about it, but most of them just sort of avoid it. And I think part of the reason is there were so many, predictions made over the last several decades. Is sort of Bible prophecy a bad reputation, and there's certain figures that would predict dates and that kind of thing. And then people would sort of laugh at it and think there's 2,000 years of history of people believing this was it, and they've all been wrong, right? So in that sense, Bible prophecy sort of got shoved over to the corner, and so the great irony is that now we're watching all this stuff happen, and now we're largely not talking about this, and there's dozens, if not hundreds, of prophecies in the Old Testament that many Bible prophecy experts believe predicted the coming of Jesus, and even Rick Warren, he came out in an e-newsletter here a couple of years ago and said, if all the prophecies of Jesus's first coming came true, which he believes they did, then it stands to reason that all the prophecies of his second coming are going to come true too. So that only God could accurately predict everything that's happened in history through these prophets and the biblical books, and so. When you really study the prophecies, it becomes apparent to you that, God did sort of lay out the history of the world and the future. And there's a great deal of evidence as you really dig into this.
Okay. And Troy, do you see any danger you're a journalist and you have to your job is based on your objectivity. So you'd see any danger in any of this stuff by, like the true believer that just has his own opinion and nothing can change? Could there also be a danger from that kind of an element?
Well, yeah, of course. People get too obsessed with this kind of thing and too dogmatic about how everything is going to unfold. Like with this controversy about the rapture. So you've got a large segment of sort of the Bible prophecy community saying they believe that the rapture won't happen until the mid part of the tribulation, or maybe at the end. And then there's sort of the popular Left Behind kind of theology that there's a pre-trib rapture. So there's these differences within Christianity. Of course, nobody knows for sure, right? Only God knows how this is going to work. And there's other types of things like that. So it's good to be wise, to be moderate, and to realize that we're not perfect. We can't figure out everything, but I believe we can sort of generally figure out that we're approaching these kind of events just based on what the kind of signs that Jesus and other prophets told us to look for, and what we're seeing unfolding in the news now.
Okay, and so there would also be people who would say, well, I'm not sure about the people that your sources for the book. So, and I'm going to use Billy Graham, God rest his soul, as an example. They'd say, "Oh, he's friends with the Bushes. He's one of them." But he's part of your book. So, where does Billy Graham? And when you talk about the church, what church are we exactly talking about?
Okay, yeah. So, sometimes I'll post a quote from Billy Graham on Facebook, and somebody will make this claim that, he's friends with the Bushes and different presidents over the decades, or maybe he's a Freemason or something like that. And I've dug into this kind of thing and could find no evidence of that. There's all kinds of wild, conspiracy kind of things out there on social media. And, he was a very diplomatic man. He was, throughout the Bible, you'd often see sort of the prophet that would, have access to the king. And so in a sense, Billy Graham, to a certain extent, sort of fulfilled that role in modern times, I believe. And, I've read books about him. I actually got invited to the Billy Graham Training Center, the Cove in North Carolina, about a month before he passed away. And, got to spend time sort of wandering through the hallways there, all the pictures of his life, and talking to people about his life and his story. And it just struck me as a very credible, very devout Christian man, a great man of God. And so I trust that, he was telling the truth. And so even if he had associations, even if he made some mistakes in his life, we all do, it's just sort of the way politics and religion work in our modern world. What was the second part of the question?
It was just more about what church, because I think it's Trumpocalypse, you talk about leaders of the church, and there are a number of different churches. So which are we talking about? The Catholic Church, Evangelical Church, the Mormon Church, now the Latter-day Saint Church. Which church?
Oh, okay. Well, I grew up in an Assemblies of God church when I was a kid, and now I attend a non-denominational church. I go to Mariners Church in Irvine, California. And so when I talk about the church in the book, I'm referring sort of the greater body of Christ. This would be, Protestant denominations and Catholics. That's when we say a church, you sort of mean the greater body of Christ. I think there's 2.4 billion Christians, throughout the world, something like that now.
Okay, so what do you say to, and we're going to have to just jump back into this conspiracy mode, but the people that say, well, the majority of Christians are Catholics, and we're not sure where the Pope lies in all of this global elite stuff. What do you say to that?
Well, there has been growing concerns, especially among conservative Catholics, about some of the things the Pope has said and did. And, there's been several popes that have called for a global public authority. And, I don't know for sure. I haven't really dug into it that deeply, but, there are concerns out there about that aspect. But I haven't really dug into that.
Okay. Then let's talk a little bit about, in Trumpocalypse, you basically, can you give us the inspiration for the title?
Oh, okay. So the day after the election, my co-author called me. He was just like flabbergasted that President Trump had won. And so I think we had a call scheduled later that day with our literary agent. And our literary agent handled the Left Behind series and, represents a lot of faith leaders. So we got on the phone with him, and I think there was headlines in the Washington Post and the New York Times and different media outlets about the Trumpocalypse. So there's all these concerns about, President Trump is elected, he's going to bring about the end of the world. So our agent, so we're talking about this, and just struck us that this is a gigantic development, because the Babylon Code was an expose of globalism. Now we have this president elected who's fighting against the globalists. So it seems like a sort of a natural progression. We wanted to write a series of investigative books, sort of tracking unfolding end time events as they happen. And so our agent actually, he said, why don't we call the second book Trumpocalypse? So that's how it came about.
Okay, but it's not. It's because what it really does sound like it's anti-Trump and all that, but it actually is a very interesting way of describing how kind of Trump fits like you said, he fits Patton fit the role for World War II. Trump kind of fits the mold for what we need now. Now, can you talk a little bit about the opposition to Trump? Let's talk about, first of all, the media, since that's your forte. Why are they so opposed to Trump, besides the fact that it's cheap ways to report news?
Well, yeah. Beyond, so all the media, most media companies have had a gigantic boom, and thanks to President Trump getting elected, because he's so controversial, so bombastic. You never know what he's going to say. He's not politically correct, and so it's great for in terms of news value. But beyond that, we see this massive sort of very negative coverage of President Trump. There's been polls that have been done that found that the media coverage of President Trump is far more negative than most prior presidents, at least that we're aware of. And so, why is this? And so, other polls show that, most of the mainstream media is now full of, liberals and progressives, and the percentage of conservatives has been declining for quite some time. And so there's sort of this groupthink, I believe, that emerges. And, when you work in a newsroom, you figure out the expectations of your editors and what they will allow, what they don't allow, what they like, what they don't like. And so, there's sort of this groupthink mentality that develops. But then, behind the scenes, of course, we have a very small number of very wealthy, powerful people who own most of the media corporations. And so, they exert, that they choose who the editors are, who the producers are. And so by that power can exert, what kind of news is covered. And in general, I believe that most of the decisions on coverage is made, mainly by the editor or the producer, assistant editors, that kind of thing. But there's sort of this expectation. So that's why I believe we're seeing this massive, sort of media attack on the president, because, it's recognized by these very powerful individuals that he's blocking their ultimate goal.
Well, I think that most people agree with that. And most people that are on that side of the political spectrum. But let me ask you this, Troy: Would you have been given a job, even though you did go to the UO Liberal College? Would you get a job today as a journalist if they knew of your Christian background?
I sort of doubt it. I don't know for sure, but it would probably be, unless I was applying for a job with a conservative, media outlet, a conservative editor, or somebody that sort of probably shared these kind of beliefs, it'd probably be difficult to get a job again at a, large mainstream media outlet. Yeah.
But you contribute to Reuters, right?
Yeah. Well, I stream for Reuters.
Yeah. Okay. So also, Paul McGuire, he's a contributor to CNN as well. Can you give us a little bit more about Paul?
He's, over the last couple of decades, he's been a commentator on Fox News and CNN, History Channel, Discovery Channel, and so, plus we go on, different, national and international TV shows and radio programs and that kind of thing. So, we get quite a bit of, access to the media, and I write for different, media outlets. We just believe God has sort of given us favor, and we believe very strongly this is an important message to get out to people, because there's still a lot of people that, don't fully understand what's happening.
Yeah. And now you're on Books in Hindsight. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be out there. So, all right, Troy, let me just remind people, the books are Trumpocalypse, and they are also the Babylon Code, and available at troyanderson.us. Actually, that's your website. They're available on Amazon, iTunes, Nook, and I know that because I have them all posted at booksinhindsight.com, and I'll put them on hindsight.com sometime today. So, Troy, it's really nice talking to you. You said you were going to write a series, and what are you basically keeping track of, and what's the next project?
Yeah, my co-author Paul McGuire and I are beginning to talk about the next book. We can't release a title yet, but it's going to explore sort of the next big gigantic phenomena that's emerging. It has to do with technology, but that's all I can say at this point. I'm sworn to secrecy.
Okay, but I'm sure it's going to be frightening. So, what are readers going to get out of Trumpocalypse? Are they going to get an education? Are they going to be terrified? What are they going to come out of it with?
We've gotten hundreds of 5-star reviews on Amazon. People say it's dangerously hot, phenomenal, riveting, anointed. Can't put it down, that kind of thing. And so people are going to learn a lot about Bible prophecy. They're going to learn sort of an unusual perspective about why President Trump is president now, and a lot of evidence and interviews about sort of unfolding end time events. So most people that read this book really enjoy it. It's sort of like the Babylon Code, sort of a mystery that you sort of go on this journey of discovering these forbidden kind of knowledge kind of thing. And so we think people like it. In fact, we've got an agent in Hollywood that's beginning to shop it around to the different faith divisions of the Hollywood studios, and so we'll see if we end up some kind of film here.
Okay. And we're getting pretty close to the end. I want to ask you one or two more questions. What does immigration have to do with Trump?
Okay. Well, one of the concerns is that with all this sort of illegal immigration going on in Europe, and of course here in America, that is this being used by the elite to somehow weaken our democratic system, and of course the Democrats would like to legalize a lot of these people so they get more voters essentially, and so there's sort of these complicated, very sophisticated strategies involving immigration. Of course, we have laws in America about legal immigration, and we're all pretty much immigrants. My ancestors came here over the last several hundred years, and probably yours did too, and most of us. So, but it's about the matter of illegal immigration and what kind of threats some of these people coming to the country pose. And so, I'm not really totally up on all the intricacies of the immigration thing, but that's sort of what I generally know.
Okay, do you think there's an anti-Christian bent to immigration policy?
Anti-Christian bent. I'm not really sure. The Bible talks about welcoming strangers and helping downtrodden and the poor, and of course there's much persecution and terrible things that happen to people around the world, especially Christians. So in that sense, it's good for us to take in people and help people, and also I think the births of Americans is not as high as we'd like, and so immigration is a good thing. God loves us, loves everybody, but we need to be. Jesus also told us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and so we just need to use common sense, and because there's a certain amount of criminals and terrorists. One guy interviewed for the Trumpocalypse, one minister said that he was told by intelligence people that the terrorists have essentially camps and cells set up all over our country. So in case something ever does happen, they can, sort of signal them. So, we live in a dangerous world, so we need to be wise and prudent in how we handle things.
All right. Well, Troy, that is just great advice. I'm going to have to end this interview now, but Troy, I cannot thank you enough for being on Books in Hindsight. I've tried to get Troy on here since December. And I had to keep going back and changing because Troy is just so busy. And the reason you couldn't get on before was because of your camera. You were going to get a camera. So I see that's working out quite well for you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My wife got me lights and a camera for Christmas. So we're sort of setting up the office as a little studio here. All
right. Did you go with the Brio and all that?
Yeah, I think we ordered it pretty much what you said.
Yeah. All right.
So thank you.
Well, you're looking great. You're looking really good.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Troy, it's really been great having you on Books in Hindsight. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and then I will talk to you for just a second. So for everybody out there, this is Troy Anderson. He is an award-winning journalist, and the books are The Babylon Code, which I want to bring Troy back to talk about, and his most recent book on Books in Hindsight, and it is also available at heinessight.com, and Troy's website is troyanderson.us. This is Matthew Hines for Books in Hindsight. Order these books as soon as you can. They're very interesting, and for everybody out there, especially all you kids, I want to encourage you to please keep on reading.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Hines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to thehindsight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Hines and other great authors.